Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. All right, we've got a really fascinating one today. We are unpacking a literal historical earthquake, a 300-year occupation by mysterious nomadic raiders that didn't just conquer a land, but completely forged the modern Russian state as we know it today. We're looking at the Mongol impact on Russia. It was basically a crucible that completely burned away the old systems of Kievan Rus and left behind a very specific blueprint for autocracy.
To really wrap our heads around this, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of the people who actually lived through it. Just listen to what one terrified Russian chronicler wrote back in 1223. We know neither from whence they came nor whither they have gone. Only God knows that, because he brought them upon us for our sins. I mean, think about that. This wasn't just your standard military defeat. It was a visceral, inexplicable shock. The Mongols arrived with such lightning speed and just overwhelming force that to the people on the ground, it literally felt like divine punishment.
So here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with the Mongol onslaught, then look at life under the Horde, followed by the rise of Moscow, the myth of liberation, and finally, the lasting legacy.
All right, Section 1, the Mongol onslaught and their terrifying reconnaissance.
Now, you might be surprised to learn that the initial wave wasn't even a full invasion. It was actually a highly effective reconnaissance mission orchestrated by Chinggis Khan. Check out the timeline we've got here. In 1223, they scouted the territory right at the Kalka River. Fast forward to 1237, and a massive force of 50,000 warriors returns. By 1240, Kiev falls, marking the absolute definitive end of Kievan Rus. But here is the crucial takeaway. The Mongols' success wasn't about outnumbering the Russians. Actually, the Kievan princes had twice as many men. The Mongols won because their cavalry was just unmatched. They had reflex bows, unbelievable stamina from their nomadic migrations, and flanking tactics they'd perfected over years of hunting. Oh, and the famous Russian winter? It was actually a huge advantage for the Mongols. They preferred fighting when the rivers and marshlands were frozen solid.
Let this number sink in for a second. 2/3. That is the estimated fraction of Kievan Rus towns completely destroyed by the Mongol invasion. The devastation was just absolute. People either fled into the deep forests, were killed, or were taken as slaves. In fact, the Mongols captured so many skilled craftsmen that practically no stone or brick buildings were constructed in the entire region for the next 50 years. It was a total reset.
Which brings us to Section 2, Life under the Horde.
Once the dust finally settled, Batu Khan, who was Chinggis's grandson, established his own dynasty called the Golden Horde. But here's the thing. They had zero interest in living in the dense Russian forests. They preferred to rule indirectly from the grassy steppes. And that brings us to this incredibly important concept, the Yarlik. It was basically a patent to rule. Russian princes couldn't just take the throne. They were forced to travel to the Mongol capital of Sarai, dress up in Mongol clothing, pass between purifying flames, and literally kneel at the feet of the Khan to beg for this patent. It created a system of total political dependency. Even revered legendary Russian heroes like Alexander Nevsky actively collaborated with the Mongols and put down Russian rebellions just to survive and hold on to his power.
Because the Mongols were incredibly pragmatic, but make no mistake, they were ruthless. If you wanted that Yarlik, you had to follow a strict checklist. You had to swear absolute allegiance, promise to extract the absolute highest possible tax revenue from your own people, supply soldiers for the Mongol military machine, and help enforce incredibly strict Chinese-style censuses to make sure absolutely no one was dodging their dues. And resistance? It wasn't a negotiation. Resistance meant absolute destruction.
This brutal geopolitical shockwave literally sliced Kievan Rus right in two. Look at how these paths diverge. The southwestern principalities, which included Kiev, were drawn into the orbit of Poland and Lithuania, which kept them connected to the west. But the northeastern half? It was subdivided into 14 subjugated fiefdoms, totally isolated from Europe. This brutal physical split laid the exact geographic and political foundations for the differences we still navigate today between Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus.
Let's move to Section 3, the rise of Moscow.
Now, this is fascinating, because before the Mongols, Moscow was basically just an insignificant border village. So how did it become a superpower? Well, they used a brilliantly ruthless three-step playbook. Step 1, they leveraged their geography. They used river networks for trade and dense forests as a natural defense against Mongol raids. Step 2, while rival cities like Tver tried to rebel, Moscow's princes used what you could basically call craven diplomatic submission. Take Ivan Kalita, a guy literally nicknamed Moneybags.
He traveled to Sarai, aggressively collected taxes for the Khan, and happily crushed other Russian rebellions just to outmaneuver his rivals. And step 3, which was absolutely critical, Moscow allied with the Orthodox Church.
You see, the Mongols were surprisingly tolerant when it came to religion, and they actually exempted the Orthodox Church from taxes altogether. This allowed the church to absolutely thrive. They colonized the deep wilderness and sparked this profound cultural flourishing. You can see this perfectly anchored by Andrei Rublev's transcendent icon paintings. In an era full of political humiliation, Christianity basically became the unifying marker of the Russian spirit.
All right, Section 4, the myth of liberation.
Look, no nation likes to admit that they were entirely subjugated by a foreign empire for centuries, right? So later Russian chroniclers spun some pretty incredible tales to mask the humiliation. The absolute cornerstone of this myth is the 1380 Battle of Kulikovo. Moscow's forces finally managed to defeat a Mongol army on the battlefield. Now, even though the Mongols came back and sacked Moscow just 2 years later in revenge, Kulikovo birthed a lingering, incredibly powerful national myth. This idea that Russia was the sacrificial shield that protected an ungrateful Europe from the Asiatic hordes. It's a really deep-seated grievance, and honestly, you could still hear it echoing in Russian rhetoric today.
So what about the glorious end to the so-called Tatar yoke? Well, if you read Russian history books, they call it the Great Stand on the Ugra in 1480. But the reality? It was an incredibly anticlimactic 2-week staring contest across a river. Not a single arrow was fired. The truth is, the Golden Horde wasn't beaten by some grand Russian military campaign. Their empire had already been decimated from the inside by the Black Death and intense internal fracturing. They'd basically just turned around and went home.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, the lasting legacy.
So, how exactly did these 3 centuries fundamentally hardwire the Russian state? Well, it's interesting because Russians themselves fiercely debate this. Broadly, there are 3 conflicting historical views. You've got the entirely negative view, championed by figures like Vissarion Belinsky, arguing the Mongols plunged Russia into a dark age that permanently isolated it from Europe. Then you have the positive foundation view, held by Eurasianists like Vernadsky, who argue that the Mongols actually birthed autocracy and serfdom, which they see as the necessary price for national survival. And finally, you have complete denial from historians like Karamzin and Likachev, who claim the Mongols came, plundered, and left without a trace. But honestly, that denial view completely ignores the massive institutional borrowing that took place. Let me show you what I mean. Take this concept right here, Krugavaya Peruka, which means joint responsibility. The Mongols used this highly coercive method to collect taxes. Imagine if one person in your town couldn't pay, so the whole village was punished, beaten, or taken hostage. That's what this was. It forced communities to govern themselves collectively just to survive the crushing tax burden. And it birthed a systemic dependency and a collective mindset that Russian Tsars and eventually the Bolsheviks would exploit for centuries to come. Then there is kormlenie, which literally translates to feeding from the land. Because Russian princes lacked the hard currency to pay their officials, they adopted this system widespread during the Mongol era. Officials were sent out to a region and essentially told to feed themselves by extracting goods and money from the locals. It basically legalized extortion. This practice is the deep, historical root of the corruption that has plagued the Russian bureaucracy for hundreds of years.
And this right here is the most profound legacy of all, the Tsar as the Khan. Yes, the Muscovite princes eventually drove out the Khans, but then they simply stepped right into their shoes. The Mongol Khans demanded absolute submission and believed they personally owned all the land. The Russian Tsars adopted this exact same patrimonial principle. The ruler owned the realm, period. The boyars, the elites, only held their land and their wealth on the strict condition of their service to the Tsar. If they left his service, they lost everything. It created this incredibly tight oligarchic system totally dependent on the ruler's favor. And political scientists note that this patrimonial dynamic still echoes loudly in modern Russian power structures today.
Which leaves us with this final thought. As the great Russian historian Karamzin once reluctantly admitted, Moscow owes its greatness to the Khans. So I want to leave you with this question to ponder. If the very foundations of the Russian state, its autocracy, its bureaucracy, its collective dependency, were forged in the crucible of Mongol occupation, how much of that 300-year-old empire still beats in the heart of modern geopolitics today? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I will catch you next time.